You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 30th of October 2024 on Monocle Radio.
It's 2 a.m. in Beijing, 1900 in Geneva, 1800 here in London and 1500 in Montevideo. That's the time on Monocle Radio, brought to you by Chanel Watches. China hauls the EU before the WTO in a row over EVs. Canada levels an extraordinary accusation against one of India's most powerful politicians. And would the Vox Populi be more harmonious if everyone was compelled to join the chorus? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Isabel Hilton and Marta Lorimer will discuss today's big stories, and we'll meet the artist Pamela Fatsimo Sundstrom as her new exhibition opens in London. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Isabel Hilton, founder of China Dialogue and a visiting professor at King's College London's Lau Institute, and by Marta Lorimer, lecturer in politics at Cardiff University. Hello to you both.
Hello.
Hello.
You have, as is often the case, either just been or are going places, but you have also both been, as I understand it, just been or about to indulge in cultural offerings. And Isabel, I put it to you that you have voluntarily attended a performance of tap dance.
I did, and it was extremely good, actually. I mean, as tap dance goes, pretty sophisticated stuff. Under the auspices of Sadler's Wells, so there. Not actually in Sadler's Wells, as I discovered rather late in the day, and had to sprint.
Was this massed tap dancing or a soloist?
No, it was a company telling a story. And really well produced.
Through the medium of tap.
Yes, there you go, Andrew. This is a wonder that you have yet to discover, clearly, but it is pretty good. Yep.
And Marta, can you compete with that?
Yes, I can compete with that. I am, after the show, going to make my way to a cabaret show, an alternative cabaret show in central London, not a location quite as prestigious as Sadler's Wells. But I am expecting drag queens, burlesque acts, drag kings, music, all of the fun stuff.
And any tap dancing?
I don't think so, but I actually wouldn't be surprised if that happened.
Oh, dear Lord. Two would be a coincidence. If any listeners do witness a third manifestation of tap dancing, it does become officially a thing. I did not have that on my 2024 bingo card. Anyway, we will start with China, which seems unheeding of the idea that there's no point in trying to get anything accomplished between now and next Tuesday. China has filed suit against the European Union before the World Trade Organization. Vexed by the extremely steep tariffs the EU has recently slapped upon Chinese electric vehicles in a bid to protect the European equivalent. Though China has previously threatened to retaliate by sticking tariffs of their own on some European products, China now appears to want the matter properly resolved and or realises that hiking the price of a bottle of decent brandy will be unpopular. Isabel, first of all, do the Chinese really have a case here? Because the EU's argument fundamentally is that because China is able to produce at vastly bigger scale with vastly smaller labour costs, they can just dump enormous quantities of EVs on Europe at a price with which the locals cannot compete.
That is true, but it is also true that at every stage for many years the industry has been supported in different ways by the state. I mean, this now seems like an old-fashioned argument since the United States has an industrial policy and the UK is looking at one and the EU is looking at one. But back in the days of when the WTO was bright, confident morning, its job was to look for subsidies that rendered competition unfair. And it is true that the Chinese EV industry has been massively supported, but as a result of that, it has become enormously efficient. And it's not just about labour costs, it's about streamlining supply chains, it's about a virtual monopoly of the inputs to batteries, it's about innovation. The Chinese car companies are not the traditional car companies. They tend to be digital companies that have gone into cars. And in contrast to Germany, where a rather complacent car industry, in fact, most of the EU, where 6% of the economy is involved in the motor industry, but it has, because it was very good at the internal combustion engine, it has allowed the Chinese to steal the future. And now there's a bit of a panic. And one of the reasons that they have been very slow to respond is that in recent years, the Germans, particularly the huge companies like VW, were selling 40% of their cars in China. So right now, they're losing market share in China and in Europe, and it's a crisis.
Is there a spectre, Marta, haunting European car manufacturers akin to what happened to American car manufacturers at the hands of Japanese imports in the 70s and 80s, that the Japanese cars, which started out as a joke, progressively got better and more reliable and less expensive, and Americans started preferring them?
This seems to be something that is on the mind of European leaders, particularly people like Emmanuel Macron, who are genuinely worried that Europe is losing competitiveness and it is becoming unable to innovate in any meaningful way. And this is precisely why they are starting to think about whether there needs to be an industrial policy. But it's also something very difficult for EU leaders to negotiate, because there are very different positions on whether there should be such a thing as an EU industrial policy. Some countries are heavily against this very Franco-French idea that we should be subsidizing our own industries to become more competitive. And it certainly doesn't seem particularly clear where or even how Europe might go about agreeing to some kind of strategy to become competitive again.
Another possible angle on this, Isabel, is it being untowardly paranoid to wonder whether allowing China to get a substantial toehold in personal transportation in Europe might be about as bright an idea as encouraging China to build communications and energy infrastructure?
Oh, there's a very close connection because it's not about the transmission. It's not about the drive shaft. It's about the fact that these cars are connected and they remain connected. If you drive a Tesla in China, you are not allowed to drive anywhere near a military base, for example. You're not allowed to drive around town when Xi Jinping is visiting. And there's a lengthening list of places that you're not allowed to drive. And the data that Tesla harvests from each and every one of its vehicles has to stay in China. We have no such regulations here. And there was a famous case in the early days of the Ukraine war when the Russians, in fact Chechens, stole two extremely expensive John Deere agricultural, bits of agricultural machinery. I'd call them tractors, but they're the size of a kind of removal truck, and hideously expensive. And they drove them off merrily to Chechnya, at which point the place they'd stolen them from in Ukraine hit the kill switch, and they become lumps of useless metal, because that's the reality of digitally controlled vehicles. Now, you don't have to be too paranoid to think, well, if, there was a problem in the Taiwan Strait and China wanted to distract everyone for 12 or 24 hours, a massive snarl up in London where all the electric, or Paris or Berlin, where all the electric cars just stopped, would be a really interesting distraction. And it would, how political, how governments can only cope with one crisis at a time.
On a related front, there is reporting, because obviously a lot of what China is doing, Marta, is governed by their run-ins with the United States over the last few years. And it is worth remembering that in many respects, President Joe Biden maintained the attitude towards China of his predecessor, Donald Trump, who may shortly be back with us. But there is reporting, very good piece in Politico, that some EU officials, though notably not keen to put their names alongside the quotes, think that a Trump win, though it's not something they welcome in and of itself, might actually be usefully bracing for Europe, that this would be the moment at which, I mean, there's been several broad hints of this sort in the last few years, but this would be the moment at which Europe would have no choice but to realise we do have to look after ourselves.
There's a famous adage in EU and the EU integration process, and it's the idea that Europe will be made in crises. And I think this is what some of these officials are banking on, that once Europe is in a situation where it has no one to pick up the slack for it, basically, that it is going to actually get going in perhaps an imperfect way, but at least in some way. I'm perhaps not as optimistic. The previous Trump presidency perhaps did catch Europe unawares, so they didn't take full advantage of the opportunities that they had then. But I don't really see that the EU is right now in a position where it is going to get moving. There are no European leaders at the moment that would be really able to foster any kind of serious integration of the kind that these diplomats seem to be looking for. So I really wouldn't be quite as optimistic about a Trump presidency being useful for future European integration.
Nevertheless, and just finally on this one, Isabel, I found it difficult to disagree with the remarks by French Minister for Europe, Jean-Noël Barrot, that we cannot leave Europe's security in the hands of voters in Wisconsin every 4 years.
Fair point. And I think that actually on the security front, there's likely to be faster and better action than on the economic and industrial front. But as a geopolitical move, I have to say it's long been an ambition in Beijing to divide the EU and the United States. And it was an ambition that was postponed by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But a Trump presidency, if it's on form, could achieve that Chinese ambition really quite quickly.
Well, to Canada now, and to an astonishing escalation in the already extraordinary row it is conducting with India. The two countries were already at loggerheads, whatever loggerheads even are, over Canada's accusations that India was involved in last year's murder of Hardeep Singh Nijjar, a Sikh nationalist activist shot dead outside a Godawa in a Vancouver suburb. Canada has now named the individual it believes responsible for this and for a campaign of harassment against prominent Sikhs in Canada more broadly. It is no less a figure than Amit Shah, India's Minister for Home Affairs and close friend and ally to Prime Minister Narendra Modi. It's hard to know where to start with this, Marta. We should probably start by noting that India denies everything, but it is also quite difficult to imagine Canada making this up, isn't it?
It doesn't sound like the kind of allegation that you would really make up. Let's say it just doesn't really make sense as something to make up. It's a nice reminder of the golden era of Stalinism. This genuinely reminded me of Stalin sending people to murder Trotsky in Mexico. And it is certainly a worrying sign of where Modi is moving to and the increasingly authoritarian tones of his leadership.
I mean, it is of a piece, if true, Isabel, with the behaviour of certain other regimes who make a thing of pestering their diasporas overseas. But from the point of view of the regimes that do that, what's in it for them? What sense does it make? I ask as somebody who sleeps reasonably soundly, suspecting that, the Australian Secret Intelligence Services are not really paying that much attention to what I'm doing.
Well, I hope that you're absolutely right about that.
Unless they're really good.
Look, I mean, China does this, Russia does this famously, murders people abroad. I think in Russia's case, murdering people who've offended Putin seems to be fairly standard playbook. In China's case, it's intimidating the increasingly large number of exile Chinese, but also particularly Hong Kong people. There are 2 people in custody at the moment who were associated with the a commercial Hong Kong entity in London who are accused of harassing and intimidating Hong Kong exiles. So it's shutting up the exiles, and the Sikhs have been a very long-standing, this goes back to Mrs. Gandhi, that you had a very long-running and disciplined and dedicated Sikh exile community that essentially wants a Sikh homeland, and they're not going to give up. It's quite shocking that the country long, praised as as the largest democracy in the world should be doing this. But there was an extraordinary quote from Modi's election campaign where he essentially said, "This is India, this is Modi, we come into your house and kill you," which is a pretty remarkable thing for a man touting for election.
Well, they didn't put that on the posters, no.
No, they didn't. But it's also true that Sikhs in the Midlands have been contacted by the police and warned that they had picked up intelligence on threats to them. So again, it's not just in Canada, it's wherever there are these communities that are seen as a threat by a regime like Modi's that is, based on one religion in a country that has many.
And it does prompt the question, Marta, of what you can actually do, and this question has been asked about China and Russia before, what you can do about a country of that size, that heft and that importance that does go fully rogue. There has just recently been in Samoa the gathering of the Commonwealth heads of government, of whom Narendra Modi is one. The Commonwealth has thrown members out before. Would that kind of thing make any difference?
With a country of India's size? Probably not. I think that is the problem, that it's relatively easy to be tough on smaller countries. But once you're dealing with what is essentially a powerhouse at this point, it becomes much harder to have any form of effective sanctions. And I think that this seems to be what Canada is also struggling with, that they can say, well, we're going to expel the diplomats, but beyond that, and that is going to give a sign, but beyond that, it is really quite difficult to, I suppose, bring them back into the fold if you don't have a leader that is particularly keen on it.
And just finally on this one, Isabel, is there also a subsidiary difficulty to exactly that Canada has, that it's relatively easy, for example, to saddle up a posse to sanction Russia or Iran or North Korea or one of those countries that nobody really likes. But even Canada's allies within the Commonwealth, within the Five Eyes community, are very, very invested in keeping India on side.
Absolutely, and that is probably would be regarded as the major issue here, because in a very, very uncertain world with a very tense Asia Pacific, actually having India on side and not making up with China is pretty important strategically.
Well, let's move along, and this week's Foreign Desk Explainer, which should be available shortly, takes a long look at Uruguay's orderly, decorous and frankly downright tedious election conducted at the weekend. Slight spoiler, the Explainer gets around to suggesting that one reason for Uruguay's blessedly uneventful politics is that Uruguay is one of those small number of countries which enforces a compulsory vote. Part of the argument for such a rule is that it insulates a polity against extremism by forcing politicians to campaign to a broad electorate, not a motivated base. Other components of the case are that compulsory voting fosters a creed of participation and reminds that citizenship of a democracy endows responsibilities as well as rights. Marta, first of all, I come from a country, i.e. Australia, which this year celebrated its 100th year of a compulsory vote. It was brought in after the 1922 election, only got 60% of Australians to the polls. Regular listeners will be familiar with the fact that this is a bit of a hobby horse of mine. I am massively in favour of the compulsory vote. Where are you on this? Would you like to take the crazed libertarian oppositional perspective?
Why crazed? I love voting. I really enjoy voting. If I vote in every election. This year I was very unhappy that I had to do a postal vote in my first British election. But from here to, I do see a problem with essentially making voting compulsory. I suppose it has to do with how you think of the vote. Do you think of voting as a right or as a responsibility? And I presume it can be both, but making a free vote puts it a little bit more on the sides of a right rather than a responsibility. Whereas the compulsory vote, I think, does feel like an imposition. And
it is an imposition, but my argument would be it's an imposition to like wander to the schoolhouse at the end of the road every 5 years and put a cross on a box.
But that's probably the case for you. For example, where I was voting in Italy, I would have had to say if my parents couldn't drive me to the station, it was going to be about a 1 hour walk. And
it'll do you good. It'll do you good.
Yes, of course. If the election is in June and climate change hasn't hit and it's not 40 degrees, it's a great walk. But I think it does pose the problem of if you are going to have compulsory voting, you are going to have ways to make sure that everyone has a fair chance to vote and that you're not ending up punishing sections of the population that are already disadvantaged. Because this is essentially the biggest problem. We know that the people who usually don't turn out to vote are those in poorer segment of the population. It's not your middle classes, your upper classes who don't vote. And the reason why lower class votes don't go is not necessarily because they don't want to, but sometimes they just can't. And that's where I worry about compulsory voting, that you are going to essentially it's almost like a tax if there is if people have to pay if they don't vote.
In Australia, it's a very minor nuisance fine.
Exactly, but it's a minor nuisance fine. Say it's £25. Okay, for me,
I don't think it's even that.
Okay, for me, it's nothing. But if you're struggling to get to the end of the month, £25 is a pretty big chunk of money. So I think I'm a bit more on the no compulsory voting. And also, if you don't want to vote, it's really none of my business. You might want to say something with that decision not to vote. So I think I'm going to, yes, I'm the crazy libertarian at the table. There it is. I didn't know that.
Outstanding. Isabel, if the infrastructure was in place to allow people to access polling stations without too much grief, which I agree is extremely important, if that's available, is the argument not then that those people who don't usually vote, and as Marta correctly points out, it does tend to be people who are not making so much money, who actually are or feel themselves to be disenfranchised. But if the vote is compulsory, then their vote is recorded, which in the current settlement, it is not.
Well, I quite agree. And I mean, there have been famous occasions recently when had, for example, more young people got out of their, whatever they were sitting on and gone to vote, we might still be in the European Union. Or if more voters from the less advantaged groups in society were to vote, maybe politicians would pay more attention to their needs. So I think that there is, at least one can hope that if democracy works at all, the fact that they turn out and vote ought to have some reward, at least in advance of an election, that they would be cultivated and promised things which they could then hold people to account for. And I don't really see the downside of mandatory voting. I'm sure the logistical problems of the perhaps relatively few people who live in villages an hour away from the polling station could be addressed by means of postal service or an online vote. Relatively easy these days. So why not? Let's if we are, you look around the world and you think democracy's in a very, very shaky, difficult place. We need more engagement with it. We need it to be rehabilitated as the least worst form of government. And I think mandatory voting would help.
Is there a point as well, though, Marta, and I'm just now addressing you as the frenzied libertarian verging on downright anarchist over there, that turnout can get so low that it does completely undermine people's, even if people have contributed to that low turnout by not voting, it does start to undermine the idea of the legitimacy of the government. In this country, for example, in local elections, barely half the population votes if you're lucky. EU elections in 2024 across Europe, turnout was barely 50%, and that was actually spiked upwards by the fact that 1 or 2 European countries do have a mandatory vote, but barely 1 Hungarian in 5 bothered to cast a vote in the EU elections. And at that point, you just think, well, what mandate is this system of government claiming to itself?
I mean, I find there's almost something a little bit patronizing about saying, oh, the reason if we made this compulsory, voters would actually show up and this would give more legitimacy to the regime. Not really, because if people are showing up and spoiling their ballots, or they're showing up because they have to rather than because they want to, then I'm not sure that you have a democratic system that is any more functional.
Even if the ballot spoilers are counted, as they are in Australia, they're rather charmingly known as the informal vote.
Oh, that's very cute. No, I mean, there is something to be said for counting counting blank votes and spoiled votes. But if you have, say, let's imagine that those 50% of people who don't normally show up all spoiled their ballots, and you end up being elected on less than 50% of valid ballots and 50% of people who said, I would rather not vote for any one of these. Is that any more legitimate as a democracy than the other one? So I find it, I don't know, I think sometimes we have to treat voters as adults and leave them the responsibility of their own choices. Even young people who don't show up and vote to remain in the European Union because they're having fun.
I think the none of the above option actually does tell us something. It tells us something about the political offer. And I think that in itself is valuable. If people just are not there, we don't know why they're not there. We don't know, were they busy that night? Do they not like what's on offer? If they turn up and spoil their ballots, at least we have a sense of what's wrong. And I think that's valuable because I'm really quite concerned about the legitimacy of democratic systems. And I think we should be as aware as we can be about how voters see them.
I make that 66% in favour on 100% turnout. Too conclusive proof now that exercise does you no good at all, especially if your bodyguards are doing it. An investigation by Le Monde has demonstrated that due to the enthusiasm for fitness app Strava among the earpieces and shoulder holsters demographic, pretty much any clown with a laptop is able to precisely trace the movements of personages including US President Joe Biden and both those seeking to replace him, French President Emmanuel Macron and Russian President Vladimir Putin. This is despite previous Strava scares in which jogging soldiers broadcast the outlines of military bases in Syria, Afghanistan and elsewhere. Isabel, is this one of those stories that just makes you kind of think we should all just really give up trying to protect any secrets or any information at all, really?
It's very tempting, isn't it? But I think the irony of security personnel being the ones who are so ill-disciplined that they give away the location of those who they're trying to is delicious. And I've always felt slightly suspicious of security systems anyway. I remember after The Independent many years ago published the first article by Salman Rushdie after the fatwa. They installed an elaborate security system, and one of the photographers mocked up an ID with the name of a famous terrorist on it, and he was greeted in a friendly way every morning by the commissionaires. So there are always flaws, and they're always human.
Is there, this may be a bit of a reach, Marta, this is part of the culture of the gamification of absolutely every aspect of our lives. As a consequence of that, do we incline to forgetting to take things seriously? Like, for example, protecting knowledge of the whereabouts of some of the most high-profile terrorist targets on Earth?
I mean, look, has exercise really happened if you haven't recorded it on an app?
Has anything?
And I think this is perhaps the really important bit, that maybe if we want to overthink this, maybe what's really happening is an individualization of society. And that is the problem, that these people are no longer the security personnel. They are doing this job not because they're really at the service of the president or whoever it is that they're serving. But they kind of don't care about that. What's most important to them is themselves, their self-care regime, and recording it in an app, because if it's not in the app, it didn't happen.
I did want to ask you both in closing if via a fitness app or anything else you have inadvertently disclosed something you should not have. If you ever hit reply all when you didn't mean to. I saw Marta flinch quite visibly there. There's something there I want to come back to. Isabel?
It wasn't a reply all, but it was an inappropriate reply. I replied about somebody to that person.
Hooray.
Oh, that took an awful lot of grovelling to get over.
Marta, what was the flinch about?
Oh no, the flinch was about my general aversion to people who do reply to all as a choice rather than as an accident. No, I think I was really trying to think about obvious professional mistakes I've made, and the only one I could remember was sending my boss to a meeting on the wrong day. But I don't think that was in any... there's a reason why afterwards I became an academic and don't have to deal with that.
You're claiming that was a mistake, I take it?
Yes, it was not deliberate. But yes, that did not result in any major national security failure. He just went to a club at a time where he shouldn't have been at the club.
Marta Lorimer and Isabel Hilton, thank you both for joining us. Finally, on today's show, in her first solo exhibition at a major UK institution, Pamela Fatsimo Sundstrom has taken over the Curve Gallery at the Barbican in London. The installation, called It Will End in Tears, creates an immersive and interactive viewing experience that leaves visitors eager to know more. Monocle's Sana Jumani sat down with Sundstrom to learn more about her inspirations, the influence of film on her work, and the viewing experience she strived to create. Sana began by asking if there was a particular piece that stood out to the artist from the installation as a whole.
Usually the answer to that question would be yes. There would often be kind of one work or one moment in the work that starts to become a bit of a flagship piece or a kind of centerpiece. But in this installation, I really challenged myself to sort of think quite large in terms of the scale of it, and that it's the first time that I've made a series of paintings that I intend to be read all together, that each one kind of refers to the other, and that you really only get a kind of full sense of the narrative or a full sense of the story once you've experienced them all.
Each work in Sundstrom's installation acts like a piece of a puzzle, which viewers are encouraged to work with to form an understanding of the broader story she is telling. She draws inspiration from a number of sources, including theatre, photography, cinema, costumery, and literature. These genres and mediums are crucial for the world she builds and helps her explore topics of identity, migratory histories, and misogynistic tropes. While creating the works for this installation, Sundstrom was influenced by film noir and crime fiction in particular.
I think maybe you can see there's a kind of a strong reference to crime novels and, obviously film noir and true crime, and all of that experience of kind of trying to piece together the truth or trying to piece together the full story by all of these bits of clues or all of these bits of symbols became really interesting to me and really fun and essentially really a kind of important part of the overall work. So the piece of film that I often have referenced when I'm speaking about the research that I did for this installation is a film from 1951 called Streetcar Named Desire. It's Elia Karzan was the director, and of course it's a film adaptation of the brilliant play by Tennessee Williams of the same title. And what I loved about Karzan's interpretation of this this interpretation of this play is how heavily, even in the form of film, he relied on these traditions of theater. So the set of the film very much reads as a film set where everything feels a bit like a facade, which you can kind of sense in this space too, that I wanted that to be very obvious, that this, from one side feels like a real building, and then on the other side immediately you understand that it's just a sham. I've also spent a lot of time with Hitchcock's films as again in a kind of a mid-century reference to Western film history, because again he was a bit of a master of the specific, that he, as a filmmaker and as a creative, spent a lot of time being very, very insistent on what he wanted something to look like or how he wanted something to feel. And as a maker, I identify with that.
The installation is immersive and blurs the lines between viewing and participating in art. Viewers walk along ramps and through doorways, peek through windows, make their way around wooden tables and consider the artworks on the walls as they make their way through the Barbican's curve. But why is it so important that viewers experience this body of work in this layout, rather than in a more traditional sense?
For me, I kind of constantly think about this idea of the framing device as this kind of postmodern concern of like, what kind of context, whether it's materially, whether it's in terms of time or space, what is needed to kind of create the context that you want for your work. And this feeling of being kind of immersed in a world that I have invented is something that's always fascinated me. You know, it's a bit of an occupation, right, to occupy this space, that I wasn't going to be satisfied with the space as it was presented, that I was going to always insist on kind of transforming it and sort of dragging it into my own world or into my own context. But what I love about film and theater is that it offers these multiple lenses to view something, or these multiple moments to view something. So looking at a work kind of in this static way offers a lot, of course, but then what is cool about this installation is that there are these series of doorways and windows and kind of look-throughs and overlaps that start to make you have to draw these connections, that you can see one thing, but then out of the corner of your eye, you see something else that sort of amplifies what you're seeing in front of you. And I personally love feeling that experience of being in a world. And I wanted to kind of offer that as an experience for folks coming into the space. And I don't think I could have achieved all of that with the paintings alone. I wanted to make a much more kind of rich and sensoric experience to accompany the paintings.
Much of Sundstrom's installation is made from wood, including the doorways, the windows, the walkways, and the ramps. She also uses wood panels for the works mounted on the walls. For Sundstrom, using this material allows her to showcase the process of creation in multiple layers rather than just the finished project.
There's something really important to me about being honest about the process that it takes to make these images. I'm often very honest about the fact that drawing has never really been easy for me, as much as I rely on it in making my work. I was never that kid in school who could draw very, very well. It's something that was always a struggle and always something that seemed to just be slightly out of my reach. And so it became an obsession, to figure this magic out. And as a result of not being the best drawer, my drawings, especially early drawings, involved a lot of erasure, a lot of starting over and a lot of whoops, that's not right. Let me blank that out and start again. And at first was something that I would try to hide very much and try to obscure all of the mistakes that I made or all of the times it took to get something right. And when I allowed those, so-called mistakes or so-called sort of gestures to start just being visible, something really cool started to happen in the work. They started to feel really alive. They started to have their own kind of movement in it. And I think that's something that's really particular to drawing. Even as these kind of become paintings now, I wanted to preserve the history of all the marks that it took to get to this image. And I think that's why I work in these kind of fine layers. And wood panel is such a great surface to accept multiple layers.
Sundstrom hopes visitors will embrace the installation's immersive nature and commit to embarking on the journey through it. She promises that, in return, her work will offer them something to take away, or, even better, leave them wanting to know more.
My hope, as always, is that they take the bait, so the bait that I sort of dangle to the viewer is a bit of a promise. I promise that my work will maybe call you from across the room. And if you decide to make that journey across the room to see the work, then I promise it's going to be worth it, right? I promise that what you see up close is going to give you even more than what you saw from far away. And then there's another promise that if you spend some more time in front of this work that you've now made this journey to go and see, the more you look at it, the more generous it becomes, the more it offers. And so, that's my hope. And, I hope that there's a feeling of a cycle, and that once you kind of come to the end, you feel compelled to start again. That would be the best. That, I think I almost got it. Let me go back to the beginning and see it again. That would be my greatest hope.
For Monocle in London, I'm Sana Jumani.
Thank you, Sana. That exhibition, It Will End in Tears, is open now at the Barbican's Curve Gallery. It runs until January 5th. That is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Isabel Hilton and Marta Lorimer. Today's show was produced by Monica Lillis and researched by Sana Jumani. Our sound engineer was Sarah Nichol. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily returns at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.